I caught another news item today because it took place in my hometown of Angleton, Texas, and neighboring Lake Jackson, Texas, all in Brazoria County, where the Brazosport Water Authority shut down a treatment facility because it detected chemicals from the routine herbicide treatment inside the water. It wasn't Monsanto's version of Roundup herbicide. Rather, it was Alligari's glyphosate herbicide, all containing glyphosate and other endocrine-disrupting chemicals. They shut it down under emergency as a, quote, precaution, but quickly brought it back online by 10:30 p.m., determining that, well, it was a safe level of glyphosate in the water, even though it accumulates and contributes to infertility, sterility, organ disruption, pregnancy, birth defects, and on and on. Here's one of the material safety data sheets for Alligari's glyphosate 5.4, and you can see how they use it all across the country, and they've got here how safe it is and how it's okay to have up to a mouthful swallowed of this herbicide and, well, to call poison control and sip more water if it's in your water, basically. But this is actually a problem that's been going on all across the country. It's part of a larger, bigger deal that really hasn't been reported on. Back in June, I did an article on Syngenta, the other GMO firm, whose CEO frequently attends Bilderberg. They had to settle with more than 2,000 water districts because they had allegedly contaminated the water supply of 52 million Americans just in the Midwest region with their herbicide, atrazine, which is not really that different from glyphosate. Both contribute to birth defects, menstrual problems, endocrine disruptions, and they are known to affect reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, and on and on. But we are repeatedly told it's safe for humans to consume and that even a lifetime of consuming plants grown with these herbicides or from drinking the water will not harm anyone, and it's okay, and it's not part of a depopulation deal, and it's banned in Europe, but just forget about it. You know what's really going on here. I'm sure you do. I'm sure you've caught on by this point. It's a larger de facto eugenics operation. While they distract you with the overhead debate about what to do about overpopulation and what kind of measures are acceptable, they've been covertly putting it in our water, in our food, in our environment for 100 years, for decades. It's been in there. They're doing it. They don't want you even focusing on that, and it's accumulating in your body. It's contributing to it's contributing to all the health effects we've seen surfacing in the population, cancer, and all the other problems. This brings us to some rather disturbing news just from today. Big Sis begins releasing biological agents into Boston subway, and again assures the public it's completely safe, even though the government has a total and thorough history of experimenting on the public in open-air experiments without the consent of anyone, without informing anyone what's going on. Homeland Security will begin releasing what they say is a dead bacteria into the Boston subway as part of a test to detect biological agents that could be deployed by terrorists, whoever those terrorists are, never mind the actual government entity releasing it into the actual subway where real people are going. But they're telling you it's safe, it's not going to affect anyone who's healthy, never mind what it would do to people who are already unhealthy. And they have not been forthcoming about what exactly this bacteria compound consists of, but they say, oh, it's a safe food supplement. If you can even believe them, if you can believe anything this government says, especially when it comes out of the Department of Homeland Security. But I've got their document, 33 pages or so, telling you how safe and tested it all is. But I also have piles and piles of documents of unauthorized, illegal experimentation on humans going back a minimum of 100 years, including the very well-known release of bacteria in the New York subways back in the 60s, where more than 1 million people were exposed to what they said then was safe, even though it caused health effects and possibly even deaths. They did it more quietly in Chicago, and that's just scratching the surface. Why do they say they could do this? Well, they've written an illegitimate law under U.S. Title Code 50 subsection 1520A, subparagraph B, where they say, well, there's restrictions on the use of human subjects for testing of chemical or biological agents, but, and I've got a tile here with that law if we want to read it together. It says prohibited activities are, according to the Secretary of Defense, they may not conduct directly or by contact any test or experiment involving the use of chemical agents or biological agents on the civilian population, and furthermore, any other testing of a chemical agent or biological agent on human subjects would be prohibited. So that sounds good, that sounds safe. The government has agreed not to test on us until you read the exceptions in paragraph B. Subject to subsection C, D, and E of this section, the prohibition of testing on human subjects does not apply to tests or experiments carried out for any of the following purposes. 1, any peaceful purpose related to medical, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, agricultural, industrial, or research activities. That's a pretty wide spectrum already. But the subsection goes on to explain how also not prohibited of unauthorized human testing is any purpose related to the protection against chemical and biological weapons or related agents. It also says any law enforcement purpose at all. Any law enforcement purpose, including a purpose related to riot control, would not be controlled by the prohibitions on testing on human subjects. And it goes on to say how they're supposed to do informed consent, but it's been interpreted over and over that just posting these obscure laws in the mile-long U.S. title codes somehow itself is consent. And you've got piles of documents. There's a really good Wikipedia entry, the Unethical Human Experimentation in the United States document, which details hundreds of examples. You've also got a brief history of human experiments, where I've highlighted 23 examples. I'll just name a few of them here. Dan Badandi has been researching this area as well. He's going to do a detailed report later in the week. But you've got things like Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine, testing on mental institution patients and influenza virus, all without informed consent. You've got, going back to 1892, the injecting of women with serum from patients with syphilis. You've got Dr. Cornelius Rhodes with the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Investigations infecting humans with cancer cells. That's back in the 1930s. You've got the well-known Tuskegee syphilis experiment starting in the early 30s, which went on for more than 40 years without any informed consent. When it was later found and explained and the cover-up began to end, you know what they said in the 1970s? They said, society can no longer afford to leave the balancing of individual rights against scientific progress to the scientific community. They said in the 70s in the panel that investigated the Tuskegee experiments that you don't have individual rights, and in the name of science, they're going to experiment on basically whoever they want. And you've got other quotes here as they detail how more than 239 populated areas were contaminated with biological agents just in a span of 20 years from 1949 to 1969. John D. Rockefeller led an investigation in the 90s, probably covering up for his own family's role in so many of these experiments, where it found that the Department of Defense alone had experimented on literally hundreds of thousands of military personnel in human experiments and through exposure to known dangerous substances. That's just the military soldiers. That's just the scratching of the surface, the limited amount they had to admit to in government investigations. They also took advantage of all kinds of vulnerable populations, of course, prison populations, but also pregnant mothers, babies, poor people, foreigners in Latin American countries, where they did experiments that at the time wouldn't have even been allowed inside the United States. They used Seventh-day Adventists, told them that if they weren't going to fight in wars, that they had to subject themselves to these human experiments, and lots of other vulnerable groups as well. That was all just before they moved on to the general public and began bombarding cities with bacterial and chemical agents in planes spraying over large metropolitan areas. They injected people with uranium, plutonium, and other radioactive elements. They hit indigenous populations in Alaska with radioactive elements, spraying it on entire population areas. They did stuff like this over and over and over throughout the decades, time and again. It's some of the most well-known corporations and research scientists, and they were all promoted, never prosecuted, and protected completely by the government as they used the population to test on. It really makes me sick to read. I don't have time to go through all these examples. Again, Dan Badondi's going to do a detailed report later, and Alex covers it in detail in Endgame, the blueprint for global enslavement, explaining how it's part of the de facto eugenics operation being waged against all of humanity. They took the real eugenics, but then they applied it in a de facto sense to the general population. You were being assaulted, you're being killed, and you're being gone after with chemical, biological, and radioactive elements while they get you afraid to look under your bed because of so-called terrorists. The government has killed more civilians, more regular people, more innocent people just in the 20th century alone than any other unnatural cause of death. Known as democide. You better look it up. You better get your facts straight, and we better start to fight back against this government who has usurped us, fought against us, and tried to kill us.
The elite have left a massive wave of destruction behind them as they cold-bloodedly experiment on civilian populations as if we are lab rats. A string of congressional investigations has uncovered more than 20,000 secret tests that were carried out against the American people between 1910 and 2000. One well-known eugenics study, the Tuskegee Syphilis Project, killed hundreds of blacks and spanned 40 years until whistleblowers exposed it in 1972. From 1943 until present, the British have tested lethal nerve gas on their own personnel, on land, air, and sea. Many died instantly. Still others died grueling deaths over several years. The federal government commissioned secret radiation experiments on thousands of non-consenting patients. Hundreds of hospitals in the U.S. injected healthy men, women, and children with uranium and plutonium at dosage levels ranging from non-therapeutic to lethal, killing many of the test subjects. Pregnant wives of GIs were given vitamins by base doctors that actually consisted of highly radioactive uranium-239 and plutonium-241, resulting in violent miscarriages and the death of the mothers.
Here's today's daily quote. The value of man should be seen in what he gives and not in what he is able to receive. That's Albert Einstein, and we hope you'll keep watching. Tune in to planetinfowars.com, create your own channel, and don't forget to help support us financially and by getting the educational materials you can help distribute yourself at prisonplanet.tv.
Visit infowars.com and prisonplanet.com. When you're on the site, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.